Plato, a name that echoes across 24 centuries. And still, we haven't outgrown him. Born around 428 BCE in Athens into one of the city's most powerful aristocratic families, he had every advantage: wealth, connections, political lineage. He could have become a statesman, a general, a ruler. The path was laid out for him. But something happened that changed the entire trajectory of Western thought. He met Socrates, and that meeting broke everything open. Socrates didn't teach Plato facts. He taught him how to question, how to dismantle assumptions, how to chase truth relentlessly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Plato watched his mentor interrogate the most confident men in Athens, politicians, poets, generals, and one by one, Socrates exposed them. They didn't know what they claimed to know. That left a deep mark on the young Plato. But then came the moment that radicalized him. In 399 BCE, Athens, the so-called cradle of democracy, executed Socrates, put him on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety, found him guilty, made him drink hemlock. The man who devoted his entire life to truth, killed by the state for asking too many questions. Plato never recovered from that, and he never forgave democracy for it. That's the wound at the center of his entire philosophy. You can feel it running through everything he wrote: his distrust of the crowd, his obsession with justice, his conviction that most people are living in illusion and that only a rare few can see things as they truly are. After Socrates' death, Plato traveled Egypt, southern Italy, Sicily. He studied, he absorbed, he encountered Pythagorean thinkers who reshaped how he thought about mathematics and reality. And then he came back to Athens and did something extraordinary. He founded the Academy, one of the first institutions of higher learning in the Western world, a place dedicated not to rhetoric or political maneuvering, but to philosophy, to mathematics, to the relentless pursuit of what is real. And he wrote dialogue after dialogue after dialogue, not dry treatises, living, breathing conversations, with Socrates almost always at the center, asking the questions no one else dared to ask. So who was Plato? He wasn't just a philosopher. He was a man shaped by loss, driven by outrage, and consumed by one question: what does it mean to live rightly in a world that kills its wisest men? That question haunted him for the rest of his life, and his answers, they reshaped the entire foundation of Western civilization. This is probably Plato's most famous idea, and there's a reason it survived for over 2,000 years. It's not just a story, it's a diagnosis. In Book 7 of the Republic, Plato lays out a scene that's deceptively simple. A group of prisoners, chained inside a dark cave since birth. Their necks are fixed, their legs are bound. They can only look in one direction, at a blank wall. Behind them, there is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk back and forth carrying objects, statues, figures, shapes. The fire casts shadows of these objects onto the wall, and that's all the prisoners ever see: shadows. Flickering, distorted, flat representations of things they've never actually encountered. Here's the devastating part. The prisoners don't know they're looking at shadows. They think that is reality. They give the shadows names. They debate which shadow will appear next. They build an entire world of meaning around something that isn't even real. Plato is not telling a children's story here. He's making a claim about the human condition. He argues that most people live exactly like those prisoners, chained, not by iron, but by ignorance. by comfort, by the sheer habit of never questioning what's in front of them. But then something happens. One prisoner is freed, unchained, forced to stand, to turn around, to look at the fire for the first time. And it hurts. The light burns his eyes. He's confused, disoriented. Everything he believed shattered in an instant. He doesn't want to move forward. He wants to go back to the wall, back to the shadows, because at least the shadows made sense. And Crito knows this. He's pointing out something deeply uncomfortable, that the first encounter with truth is not liberating, it's painful, it's destabilizing. People don't naturally run toward the truth, they resist it. But the freed prisoner keeps going. He's dragged. Plato uses that word deliberately. Dragged up a rough, steep path out of the cave and into the sunlight. And at first, he's blinded. He can't see anything. Slowly, his eyes adjust. He sees reflections in water, then objects. Then the stars. And finally, the sun itself, the source of all light, the source of all visibility. Plato argues that the sun represents the form of the good, the highest truth, the ultimate reality that makes everything else intelligible. Without it, nothing can be truly known. It's not just another object in the sky. It is the reason anything can be seen at all. Now, here's where it gets really dark. The freed prisoner goes back into the cave. He wants to tell the others what he's seen. He wants to free them. But what happens? They laugh at him. They think he's gone mad. And Plato warns, if he tried hard enough to unchain them, they would kill him. That's not a throwaway line. Plato is almost certainly referencing the execution of Socrates, the man who tried to wake Athens up and was sentenced to death for it. The cave isn't just a metaphor for ignorance. It's a metaphor for what societies do to those who challenge the accepted version of reality. And that's why this allegory still cuts deep. Plato isn't just describing a problem of ancient Athens. He's describing a permanent feature of human life. The shadows change. They always do. But the chains, the resistance to truth, the hostility toward anyone who questions the wall, that, Plato argues, stays exactly the same. Here's something Plato wants you to sit with. Everything you see, every tree, every chair, every face is a copy, a shadow, a pale imitation of something far more real than anything your eyes will ever touch. That's the theory of forms, and it changes everything. Plato argues that the physical world, this world we walk through, breathe in, build our lives around, is not the real world. It's a world of appearances, of things that shift, decay, and eventually disappear. A flower blooms, then it dies. A building stands tall, then it crumbles. Nothing here lasts. Nothing here stays the same. So Plato asks a devastating question. How can something that's constantly changing be truly real? His answer? It can't. For Plato, true reality exists somewhere else entirely, in a realm he calls the world of forms, or ideas. These forms are perfect, eternal, unchanging templates of everything that exists in the physical world. There's a form of beauty, a form of justice, a form of equality, a form of a circle. And every beautiful thing you see down here, it's just participating in, reflecting, that perfect form of beauty up there. Think of it this way. You've seen hundreds of chairs in your life, different sizes, different materials, different designs. But somehow you recognize all of them as chairs. Why? Plato would say it's because they all participate in the form of chair, some ideal, perfect essence of what a chair is. The physical chairs are just imperfect copies, approximations, shadows of the real thing. And this is where Plato draws a hard line between two kinds of reality: the visible world, the world of the senses, and the intelligible world, the world of forms. The visible world gives you opinions, impressions, beliefs, but the intelligible world, that gives you knowledge. Real knowledge, the kind that doesn't shift with perspective or crumble with time. He's not being abstract for the sake of being abstract. Plato is making a radical claim about what it means to know something. He argues that if you only engage with the physical world, you're living in a kind of intellectual fog. You think you know things, but you don't. You're dealing with reflections, not the source. And this has massive implications, because if the forms are what's truly real, then the philosopher's job isn't to study the world around them. It's to turn away from it, to look past appearances, past the noise, past what the senses offer, and to grasp, through reason alone, what is eternal and unchanging. That's why Plato places reason above everything else. Not emotion, not sensation, not popular opinion. Reason. Because only reason can access the forms. Only reason can cut through the fog of the physical world and reach something permanent. And at the top of this hierarchy, Plato places the form of the good, the highest form, the source of all truth, all reality. He compares it to the sun. The way the sun illuminates the visible world, the form of the good illuminates the intelligible world. Without it, nothing else makes sense. It is the foundation of everything. But here's what makes this so powerful and so controversial. He's not saying the forms are just useful concepts or mental categories. He's saying they actually exist, independent of human minds, independent of the physical world. They're out there, more real than the ground beneath your feet. That's a bold claim, and it's one that has shaped and haunted Western philosophy for over 2,000 years. You can reject it, many have, but you can't ignore it. Because the moment Plato drew that line between appearance and reality, he forced every thinker after him to answer one question: what is truly real? Athens, 399 BC. A 70-year-old man stands before a jury of 500. The charges? Corrupting the youth, refusing to recognize the gods of the city. The penalty on the table? Death. That man is Socrates, and Plato, his student, sitting somewhere in that courtroom, would go on to write the most famous account of what happened next. It's called the Apology. But don't let the name fool you. There's nothing apologetic about it. Plato presents Socrates not as a man begging for mercy, not as a man backtracking on his beliefs. He presents him as a man who walks into that courtroom and essentially says, "I did nothing wrong, and I'd do it all again." That's the core of this dialogue, defiance dressed in reason. Plato structures the Apology as Socrates' own speech, his defense before the jury. And right from the start, Socrates does something strange. He doesn't hire a speechwriter. He doesn't play the political game. He speaks plainly, almost too plainly. Plato portrays him as a man who refuses to perform, who won't flatter the jury, won't weep, won't drag his children before them for sympathy. Why? Because Plato argues, through Socrates, that truth doesn't need decoration. It stands on its own, or it falls, but it never begs. And here's where it gets sharp. Socrates tells the jury that his whole life, his questioning, his philosophizing, his relentless habit of cornering politicians and poets and craftsmen and exposing what they don't actually know, all of it came from a divine mission. The oracle at Delphi declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, and Socrates, Plato tells us, didn't take that as a compliment. He took it as a puzzle. So he went around Athens, testing everyone who claimed to be wise. And what did he find? They weren't. They just thought they were. Plato makes a devastating point here. Socrates' only advantage, the only thing that made him wiser, was this. He knew that he didn't know. Everyone else was walking around with false certainty. Socrates at least had the honesty to admit his own ignorance. But that honesty made enemies, powerful ones. And Plato doesn't shy away from showing that. The trial isn't really about impiety or corruption. It's about ego. It's about a city that couldn't tolerate being told it was wrong. So, what does Socrates do when the jury finds him guilty? Plato shows him standing firm. Socrates tells them, "Death doesn't scare me. You know what scares me? Living a life unexamined, living without questioning." He argues that the unexamined life is not worth living. That line, right there, one of the most quoted sentences in the entire history of philosophy. And Plato puts it in the mouth of a man who's about to die for believing it. There's no melodrama in how Plato writes this, no theatrics, just a man calmly explaining why he chose truth over survival. And that restraint, that calm, is what makes it hit so hard. Plato isn't just recording history here. He's making a philosophical argument. He's saying, this is what happens when a society values comfort over truth, when the crowd punishes the one person willing to ask difficult questions. The trial of Socrates, in Plato's hands, becomes a trial of Athens itself, a trial of every society that silences its thinkers. And Socrates drinks the hemlock. He dies. But Plato makes sure the ideas don't. That's the whole point of the apology. The man can be killed. The questions can't. Most people hear the word love and they think romance, butterflies, passion, two people who complete each other. Plato would have dismissed all of that. In the Symposium, he doesn't just redefine love, he dismantles everything we assume about it. And what he puts in its place is far more radical, far more unsettling than any love story ever written. Here's the setup. A group of Athenian men gather at a banquet. They drink, they talk, and each one takes a turn giving a speech in praise of Eros, the god of love. Some of the speeches are elegant, some are clever. One from the playwright Aristophanes is downright mythical. He tells this famous story about humans originally having 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 faces, powerful beings, so powerful that Zeus split them in half. And ever since, we've been wandering the earth looking for our other half. It's beautiful, it's poetic, and Plato uses it as a setup, only to knock it down. Because when Socrates finally speaks, he doesn't give his own theory. He recounts what a mysterious priestess named Diotima once taught him. And her teaching? It changes everything. Plato argues, through Diotima, that love is not a god. It's not divine. It's not beautiful. Love is a daimon, something in between mortal and immortal, between ignorance and wisdom, between having and lacking. And that's the key word, lacking. Plato insists that love is born from deficiency. You don't love what you already have. You love what you don't possess. Love, for him, is a yearning, a deep, restless hunger for something beyond your reach. Not completion, not comfort, hunger. But here's where it gets truly radical. Plato doesn't stop at romantic desire. He argues that Eros, real Eros, is a force that drives the soul upward. He lays out what scholars call the ladder of love, and it works like this. You start at the bottom. You're attracted to a single beautiful body. That's natural. But then, Plato says you begin to notice that beauty in one body is the same as beauty in another. So your love expands. It moves from one body to all beautiful bodies. Then it moves again, from bodies to beautiful souls, then to beautiful ideas, beautiful laws, beautiful knowledge, and at the very top of this ladder, the form of beauty itself. Not a beautiful thing, not a beautiful person. Beauty, pure, eternal, unchanging. Plato argues that this is what love has been reaching for all along. Every crush, every obsession, every ache you've ever felt. It was never really about the person. It was about something higher, something your soul remembers but can't quite name. He's not being cold here, he's being precise. Plato doesn't reject physical love, he reframes it. He sees it as a starting point, a spark. But if you stay at the bottom of the ladder, if you cling to a single body and call that love, you've mistaken the shadow for the source, and that connects directly back to the allegory of the cave. The prisoner who mistakes flickering images for reality, that's the lover who mistakes physical attraction for true love. Plato sees Eros as the philosopher's fuel, the thing that propels the soul toward truth, toward the good, toward the forms. So no, love for Plato is not what greeting cards say it is. It's not soft, it's not sweet, it's a force, a drive, a restless, aching ascent towards something most people never even look for. And that, he argues, is both the tragedy and the glory of being human. Plato doesn't just ask what we know, he asks, how well do we know it? And that distinction changes everything. In Book 6 of the Republic, he lays out what's known as the divided line, a single line split into two unequal parts. The lower part, the visible world, the upper part, the intelligible world. And within each part, another division, 4 segments total, 4 levels of knowing, each one sharper, clearer, more real than the last. He's not ranking subjects, he's ranking states of mind. The lowest level, Plato calls it ikasia, imagination. But not the creative kind. This is the mind stuck on shadows, reflections, images of images. Think about it. Someone who mistakes a photograph for the person, a rumor for the truth, a slogan for an argument. That's ikasia. The mind isn't engaging with reality at all. It's engaging with copies. And it doesn't even know it. Plato argues this is where most people live, not because they're stupid, but because they've never been challenged to look further. They consume impressions, appearances, and they call it knowledge. One step up, pistis, belief. Now the mind is dealing with actual physical objects, real things, trees, animals, buildings, people. This is the world we can touch, see, hear. And most of us would say that's reality. That's solid ground. But Plato says no. It's better than shadows, sure, but it's still the visible world, still the world of change, decay, impermanence. You're looking at things, but you're not understanding why they are what they are. You have conviction, you have trust in the senses, but you don't have knowledge, not yet. So the line crosses over into the intelligible world, and here's where it gets serious. The third level, dianoia, thought, reasoning. This is the domain of mathematicians, logicians, anyone who works with abstract concepts. You're no longer relying on what you can see. You're working with hypotheses, definitions. Structured arguments. A triangle drawn on paper is imperfect, but the idea of a triangle, that's precise. That's eternal. Plato respects this level. He sees it as a genuine leap forward, but he also points out its limitation. Dianoia still depends on assumptions. It starts from hypotheses and works downward. It uses visible diagrams to represent invisible truths. The reasoning is sound, but the foundation is unexamined, and for Plato, that's a problem. Which brings us to the highest level, noesis, pure understanding, direct intellectual contact with the forms themselves. No images, no assumptions, no borrowed premises. The mind ascends from hypothesis to first principle and grasps reality as it truly is. This is the philosopher's domain. Plato argues that only at this level does the soul truly know, not believe, not calculate, not guess, know. The form of justice, the form of beauty, the form of the good. These aren't abstractions to be debated, they're realities to be seen, with the mind's eye. And here's what makes the divided line so powerful. It's not just an epistemological chart, it's a challenge. Plato is asking, where are you on this line? Are you living in shadows, trusting your senses, reasoning well but from shaky ground? Or have you pushed all the way up to genuine understanding? Most people, he warns, never make it past the second level. They're comfortable in the visible world. They don't feel the need to climb. But the philosopher does. The philosopher must. That's not arrogance. For Plato, it's responsibility. Now, here's something that catches people off guard. Plato despised democracy, and he didn't just dislike it quietly. He built an entire philosophical argument against it, laid it out methodically, exposed what he saw as its fatal flaw. And that flaw? It treats every opinion as equal. Every voice, every vote, regardless of knowledge, regardless of wisdom, regardless of competence. And for Plato, that was madness. See, you have to understand where he's coming from. Plato lived in Athens, the so-called birthplace of democracy. And what did that democracy do? It put Socrates, the wisest man Plato ever knew, on trial, found him guilty, and executed him. Not because Socrates committed a crime, but because the crowd decided he was dangerous. The majority ruled, and the majority got it catastrophically wrong. That left a scar on Plato, a deep one, and it shaped everything he wrote about politics after that. In the Republic, Plato lays out one of the sharpest political analogies ever constructed, the ship of state. He asks, if you were on a ship in the middle of a violent storm, who would you want steering? The passengers? A popularity contest among the crew? Or the trained navigator, the one who actually understands the stars, the winds, the currents? The answer's obvious. You'd want the expert. But democracy, Plato argues, hands the wheel to whoever's most popular, not whoever's most qualified. And that distinction between popularity and competence is the heart of his critique. He's not attacking the idea that people matter. He's attacking the assumption that desire alone qualifies someone to lead, or to choose a leader. And he goes further. Plato warns that democracy breeds a very specific kind of danger, the demagogue. The smooth talker, the one who tells people exactly what they want to hear, not what they need to hear, not the truth, just flattery, just promises. And an uninformed public, Plato argues, can't tell the difference between a leader and a performer, between substance and spectacle. That's not elitism for the sake of elitism. That's a diagnosis, a clinical one. He also points out something uncomfortable about freedom, the very thing democracy celebrates most. Plato argues that unlimited freedom doesn't lead to flourishing, it leads to chaos. When everyone does whatever they want, when no principle holds things together, when authority dissolves, what fills the void? Not more freedom, tyranny. That's Plato's conclusion. Democracy, left unchecked, collapses into the very thing it claims to oppose. He maps it out clearly in the Republic, a political cycle. Societies move from order to ambition, from ambition to wealth obsession, from wealth obsession to democratic freedom, and from that freedom straight into tyranny. It's not a random theory, it's a pattern he observed, and he presents it as almost inevitable. Now, does that mean Plato was right about everything? That democracy is purely a failure? Not necessarily, but that's not the point. The point is what he forces you to confront, the uncomfortable questions. Can a society govern itself wisely without educated citizens? Can freedom survive without responsibility? Can votes mean anything if voters don't understand what they're voting for? Plato doesn't ask these questions to be cynical. He asks them because he believes governance is serious, sacred even. It's not a game, it's not entertainment, and handing it to people who treat it that way, he argues, is a recipe for ruin. He watched it happen in Athens. He watched the crowd cheer while it killed the best man in the city, and he never forgot it. Here's one of Plato's most radical ideas, and honestly, one of the most controversial things ever proposed in political philosophy. He argues that the ideal ruler is not a politician, not a general, not a popular leader elected by the masses. No, Plato insists the only person fit to rule is a philosopher king. And he means it. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't a loose suggestion. In the Republic, Plato lays this out as the cornerstone of the just state. He states it plainly. Until philosophers become kings, or kings become philosophers, there will be no end to the troubles of humanity. That's not a hopeful wish. That's a diagnosis. But why? Why a philosopher? Because Plato sees a direct link between knowledge and virtue. In his view, the person who truly understands what is good, not what seems good, not what feels good, but what is good, that person will naturally act justly. A philosopher isn't someone who merely reads books or debates abstract ideas. For Plato, a philosopher is someone who has seen reality itself, someone who has moved beyond appearances, beyond opinion, beyond the shadows on the cave wall. And that's the key distinction. Plato draws a hard line between opinion and knowledge. Most people and most rulers operate on opinion. They react to appearances. They chase popularity. They make decisions based on what the crowd wants, not on what is actually right. And that, Plato argues, is exactly why cities fall apart. He'd seen it firsthand. Athens, the great democracy, the city that voted to execute Socrates, the city that made disastrous military decisions driven by ego and mob emotion. Plato watched all of it, and he concluded something brutal. Democracy, left unchecked, is rule by ignorance. So the philosopher king isn't just a nice idea for Plato, it's a necessity, a corrective, the only safeguard against the chaos of uninformed rule. But Plato doesn't make it easy. He doesn't say just anyone can become this ruler. The path is grueling. In the Republic, he outlines decades of training, mathematics, dialectics, years of studying abstract forms. And only after all of that, only after a person has been tested, disciplined, and stripped of personal ambition, are they fit to lead. And here's the part most people miss. Plato argues the true philosopher doesn't want to rule. That's precisely what makes them qualified. The person who craves power is the last person who should have it. The philosopher king rules out of duty, out of obligation to the city, not out of desire. That's a complete inversion of how we think about politics. We're used to people fighting for power, campaigning, strategizing, clawing their way to the top. Plato looks at all of that and says, that's the disease, not the cure. Now, is this realistic? Plato himself seems to wrestle with that question. He acknowledges the idea sounds absurd. He knows people will laugh at it, but he holds firm. He's not describing what is, he's describing what ought to be. The Republic is a blueprint for the ideal, not a manual for the probable. And that's what makes this idea so enduring. It forces a question that still cuts deep. Do we actually want the wisest people leading us? Or do we just want leaders who tell us what we want to hear? Plato's answer is unambiguous. Wisdom must govern, or the state and the soul will tear itself apart. 24 centuries later, we're still not sure we agree with him, but we haven't proven him wrong either. Plato doesn't just ask what reality is, he asks what you are. And his answer? It's not comforting. In the Phaedrus, he presents one of the most vivid images in all of philosophy, the allegory of the Charioteer, a soul depicted as a chariot pulled by two winged horses and guided by a single driver. Sounds elegant, almost poetic. But the moment you understand what each part represents, the elegance falls apart, and what you're left with is a war. The Charioteer represents reason, the rational part of the soul, the part that sees clearly, thinks deliberately, and knows where it ought to go. Plato places it in command, hands on the reins, eyes on the destination. It's the part that strives toward truth, toward the forms, toward the good. One of the horses is noble, white, strong, obedient. It responds to the charioteer's voice. It doesn't need to be whipped. This horse represents spirit, what Plato calls thumos. It's the seat of honor, courage, righteous anger, the part of you that fights for what's right, that feels shame when you fall short. It's an ally of reason, not perfect, but trainable, willing. The other horse? Dark, wild, deaf to commands. It bucks, it lunges, it pulls the whole chariot off course. This horse represents appetite, raw desire, lust, greed, the craving for pleasure without limit. Plato describes it as nearly uncontrollable. It doesn't care about truth. It doesn't care about virtue. It wants what it wants, now. And here's the tension Plato is laying bare. The charioteer isn't driving a smooth road with two cooperative horses. He's being ripped in two directions at once. One horse pulls upward, toward the divine, toward the forms, toward something higher. The other drags downward, toward the body, toward excess, toward destruction. And the charioteer, reason, has to somehow hold it all together. Plato argues that the soul is not a single unified thing. It's divided, fractured, at odds with itself. And the quality of your life, the trajectory of your entire existence, depends on which part is in control. When reason leads and spirit supports it, the soul ascends. Plato describes the chariot rising upward, catching glimpses of true reality, the eternal forms that exist beyond the physical world, beauty itself, justice itself, goodness itself. Not the shadows of these things, the things themselves. That's the soul functioning as it should. But when appetite takes over, when the dark horse overpowers the charioteer, the soul plummets, the wings break, the chariot crashes to earth, and the soul becomes trapped in a body, imprisoned in the material world, forgetful of everything it once saw. This isn't just poetry. Plato is making a structural argument about human psychology, centuries before psychology even existed. He's saying that inner conflict isn't a flaw, it's the default condition. Every human being is a battlefield, reason versus desire, discipline versus impulse. And most people let the dark horse drive. Plato doesn't pretend the solution is easy. He never says, just be rational. He knows the appetites are powerful. He knows the dark horse is strong. But he insists with absolute conviction that reason must rule, not because it's the loudest voice in the soul, but because it's the only one that can see where it's going. The charioteer isn't the strongest part of the soul, but Plato argues it's the only part fit to lead, and when it doesn't, the whole thing falls apart. That's not a metaphor. That's his model of what it means to be human. Plato doesn't just theorize about the forms. He tells a story, one of the most famous stories in the entire history of philosophy. And it hits different because it's really about you. It's called the Allegory of the Cave, and Plato lays it out in Book 7 of the Republic. Here's the setup. A group of prisoners sit chained inside a dark cave. They've been there since birth. Their necks and legs are fixed. They can only look straight ahead at the cave wall. Behind them, there's a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk back and forth carrying objects, statues, figures, shapes. The fire casts shadows of those objects onto the wall, and those shadows, that's all the prisoners see. That's their entire world. They give the shadows names. They study them. They argue about them. They think the shadows are reality. And Plato says, that's us. He argues that most people live exactly like those prisoners, chained to their senses, chained to appearances, mistaking shadows for substance. Never questioning whether what they see is the full picture, never even suspecting there's something beyond the wall. But then, one prisoner is freed, unchained, forced to stand, to turn around, to face the fire. And it burns. His eyes hurt. He's confused, disoriented. Everything he believed, everything he thought was real, suddenly doesn't hold up. The shadows weren't the truth. They were projections, copies, distortions. And Plato is clear about this. The process is painful. Growth, for Plato, isn't comfortable. It's a violent disruption of everything familiar. The freed prisoner is then dragged out of the cave entirely, into the sunlight. And at first, he can't see anything. The light is too much, too overwhelming. But slowly, gradually, his eyes adjust. He sees reflections in water, then objects themselves, then the stars, the moon, and finally, the sun. The source of all light, the source of everything visible. Plato maps this directly onto his theory of forms. The shadows on the wall, that's the world of appearances. The objects outside the cave, those are the forms. And the sun, that's the form of the good, the ultimate truth, the highest reality. But here's where the allegory takes its sharpest turn. The freed prisoner goes back. He returns to the cave, not because he wants to, but because he feels compelled, almost obligated, to tell the others what he's seen, to free them, to show them that everything they believe is built on illusion. And what happens? They reject him. They mock him. They think he's lost his mind. His eyes, now used to the sunlight, can't see well in the dark anymore. So the prisoners say, look, going up there ruined him. And Plato warns, if they could, they would kill him. That detail isn't accidental. Plato is thinking of Socrates, his teacher, the man who tried to wake Athens up and was executed for it. So what's Plato really saying here? He's saying that truth isn't popular, that most people don't want to be freed, that the cave is comfortable precisely because ignorance is comfortable, and the philosopher, the one who's seen the light, carries a burden. A duty to return, to teach, even when the world doesn't want to listen. He's also saying something about education. For Plato, education isn't about filling an empty mind with information. It's about turning the soul, redirecting it, away from shadows toward the light. That's the journey Plato maps out, from darkness to truth, from opinion to knowledge, from the wall to the sun. And the question he leaves behind is a simple one. Are you still watching the wall? Most people think they see reality. Plato says they don't, not even close. In Book 6 of the Republic, Plato introduces one of the most precise, most structured models of knowledge ever put forward in philosophy. It's called the divided line, and it's not just an abstract diagram, it's a challenge, a direct confrontation with how we think we know what we know. Here's what Plato does. He takes a single vertical line and splits it into two unequal sections. The bottom section, the larger one, represents the visible world, the world we see, touch, hear. The top section represents the intelligible world, the world we can only access through the mind. Already, Plato is making a bold claim. The world you experience with your senses, it's the lesser portion of reality. The deeper, truer reality exists beyond what your eyes can show you. But he doesn't stop there. He subdivides each section again. So now there are 4 levels, 4 distinct stages of how a human being engages with reality. And Plato arranges them in a hierarchy, from the lowest form of awareness to the highest. At the very bottom sits what Plato calls eikasha, imagination. This isn't creativity. This is illusion, shadows, reflections, images of images. Plato argues that most people operate here without realizing it. They mistake appearances for truth. They react to surfaces, to opinions they've never questioned, to secondhand impressions of things they've never actually examined. One step above that, pistis, belief. This is where people engage with physical objects directly. Real things, trees, animals, buildings. It's better than illusion, sure, but Plato insists it's still not knowledge. Why? Because the physical world changes, it shifts, it decays, and anything that changes, Plato holds, can never give you certainty. You can believe in it, but you can't know it, not truly. Now the line crosses into the intelligible world, and things get serious. The third level, dianoia, is reasoning, mathematical thinking, logic. Plato argues this is where the mind starts dealing with real structure, with forms that don't change. A triangle drawn in sand can be erased, but the concept of a triangle, that's eternal. Plato points out that mathematicians work with this kind of truth, but even they rely on assumptions. They start from hypotheses they never fully justify. So it's powerful, but it's still not the top. The highest level, noesis, pure understanding, direct intellectual grasp of the forms themselves. No assumptions, no reliance on images or sensory input. Plato argues this is where philosophy lives. This is what the trained mind reaches when it moves beyond even mathematics, when it grasps the form of the good itself, the source of all truth, the thing that makes everything else intelligible. And here's what makes the divided line so devastating. Plato isn't just describing 4 types of thinking, he's ranking them. He's saying most of humanity is stuck in the bottom 2 segments, living in shadows and surfaces, mistaking opinion for knowledge, and they don't even know it. The divided line is Plato's way of drawing a map of the mind's journey from darkness to light, from confusion to clarity. And he makes it painfully clear, the journey isn't automatic. Most people never make it past belief. They stay comfortable in what they can see and touch. They never push into the territory where real understanding begins. So the divided line isn't just a theory, it's a mirror. Plato holds it up and asks, where on this line are you? And more importantly, are you willing to climb higher?
What is justice? Simple question. You'd think someone could answer it. But in Plato's Republic, he throws this question into a room full of intelligent men and watches every single answer fall apart. That's not an accident. That's the method. Plato opens the Republic with Socrates in conversation, and right away, the definitions start coming.
The old man Cephalus says justice is telling the truth and paying your debts. Sounds reasonable, but Socrates dismantles it in seconds. Would you return a weapon to a friend who's gone mad? If honesty causes harm, is it still just? Cephalus has no reply. He quietly exits the conversation. His son Polemarchus picks it up. He argues justice means helping your friends and harming your enemies. Socrates tears that apart too. What if your friend is actually a bad person? What if your enemy is good? And more than that, Plato has Socrates press a deeper point. A just person should never harm anyone. Harming someone makes them worse, and making something worse is never the function of what is good. Then comes the real challenge. Thrasymachus, bold, aggressive, fed up with Socrates' questioning, steps in and declares that justice is nothing more than the advantage of the stronger. The powerful make the rules, the rest obey. That's it. That's justice. And anyone who plays by the rules is a fool. The unjust man, Thrasymachus argues, lives better, gains more, and wins. Plato doesn't shy away from this. He lets the argument breathe. Because he knows this is what most people actually believe, even if they won't say it out loud. Power defines right. Morality is a leash for the weak. But Socrates doesn't accept it. He pushes back. A ruler who truly rules doesn't serve himself. A doctor doesn't practice medicine for his own benefit. A captain doesn't sail the ship for his own pleasure. Every craft, every form of authority exists to serve those under it. So the just ruler serves the people, not himself. Thrasymachus is silenced, but the question isn't settled. Plato brings in Glaucon and Adeimantus, and they push even harder. Glaucon raises the famous thought experiment, the ring of Gyges, a ring that makes you invisible. If you could do anything, steal in political terms alone. He goes inward. Plato argues that justice is not primarily about laws or institutions. It's about the soul. He divides the soul into 3 parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. And justice, he claims, is the proper ordering of these parts. Reason leads, spirit enforces, appetite obeys. When each part does its own work and doesn't interfere with the others, that's a just soul. And the unjust soul? It's chaos. Appetite overrules reason. Spirit serves desire instead of truth. The person might look successful on the outside, but inside, they're at war with themselves. Plato makes the case that the just person, even if imprisoned, tortured, stripped of all reputation, is still better off than the unjust tyrant who has everything, because the just person has internal harmony. The tyrant has none. That's Plato's answer. Justice isn't a social contract. It isn't a power game. It's the architecture of the soul itself, and without it, nothing else holds together. Plato doesn't just want to describe reality, he wants to explain what makes reality possible, and that leads him to the boldest claim in all of ancient philosophy. the form of the good. In Book 6 of the Republic, Socrates is pressed by his companions. They want to know, what is the good? Define it, pin it down. And Plato, through Socrates, does something fascinating. He refuses to define it directly. Instead, he offers an analogy, the allegory of the sun. Here's how it works. Plato asks, what makes sight possible? Not just eyes, not just objects. You need light. And the source of that light, the sun. Without the sun, the eyes are useless. Objects are invisible. The whole act of seeing collapses. Now Plato takes that structure and maps it onto the intelligible world. The sun, he argues, is the analogy for the form of the good. Just as the sun provides light, which allows eyes to see visible objects, the good provides truth, which allows the mind to know the forms. So, the good isn't just another form sitting alongside justice, beauty, and equality. It's above them. It's the source that gives them their intelligibility, their reality, their being. Without the good, the forms themselves would be unknowable. They'd exist in a kind of intellectual darkness. And Plato goes even further. He argues that the sun doesn't just illuminate objects, it also gives them life, growth, existence. Plants don't just need light to be seen, they need it to be. The sun is the cause of their very existence. Same with the good. Plato claims it doesn't just make the forms knowable, it gives them their essence, their reality. The good is the reason anything exists at all. It's not just at the top of the hierarchy, it is the hierarchy. This is a staggering claim, and Plato knows it. He even has Socrates say, with a kind of dry intensity, that the good is beyond being, not just the highest thing that exists, but beyond existence itself, the source of existence, the ground of all reality. Now, Plato never fully defines what the good is, and that's deliberate. He warns that most people can't handle the direct encounter. Just as staring at the sun blinds the eyes, grasping the good requires a soul that's been trained, prepared, elevated through years of dialectic and philosophical discipline. You can't just stumble into it. But here's what's critical to understand. For Plato, the good isn't abstract in the way we might think. It's not a vague feel-good principle. It's the most real thing there is, more real than any physical object, more real than any mathematical proof. It's the foundation, the thing that holds everything else together. And this has consequences, massive ones. Because if the good is the ultimate reality, then the philosopher, the one who grasps it, isn't just smart. That person sees the structure of reality itself. And that's exactly why Plato argues the philosopher must rule, not out of desire, out of duty, because only the one who has seen the good can organize a city or a soul according to its truth. The allegory of the sun isn't just a metaphor, it's the metaphysical backbone of Plato's entire system. Everything, his politics, his ethics, his epistemology, flows from this single point. The good is the sun of the intelligible world, and without it, Plato argues, we're all just groping in the dark. If there's one rivalry that defines Plato's intellectual life, it's this one, Plato versus the Sophists. And it wasn't a polite disagreement, it was war. A philosophical war over something fundamental. What matters more, the truth or the ability to convince people you have it? The Sophists were teachers, traveling intellectuals. They showed up in Athens and offered something the ambitious desperately wanted, the power of persuasion. For a fee, they'd teach you how to argue, how to win a debate, how to speak in court, in politics, in public. And they were good at it. Dangerously good. But here's the thing Plato couldn't stomach.
The Sophists didn't care whether what you were saying was true. That wasn't the goal. The goal was winning, making the weaker argument appear stronger, making the crowd believe you, not because you were right, but because you were skilled. And Plato saw that as a corruption of the highest order. In dialogues like Gorgias and Protagoras, Plato puts Socrates directly against the most prominent sophists of the age, and what emerges isn't just a debate, it's a demolition. Socrates doesn't try to out-argue them with fancier rhetoric. He does something far more devastating. He asks them questions. Simple, precise, relentless questions. And one by one, their positions fall apart. That's the Socratic method at work. And it's built on a principle the Sophists rejected, that truth exists, that it's not just a matter of perspective, not just whoever speaks last, not just whoever speaks loudest. Plato argues that the Sophists are essentially selling a counterfeit. They dress up opinion as knowledge. They give people tools to manipulate, not to understand. And in doing so, they poison public life. Because when persuasion replaces truth, power goes to the most eloquent, not the most wise, not the most just. And he draws a razor-sharp distinction here. Philosophy, real philosophy, seeks truth. Rhetoric, the way the Sophists practiced it, seeks control. One liberates the mind, the other enslaves it. Plato doesn't mince words about this. He compares sophistic rhetoric to cookery. It might taste good, but it has no concern for what's actually healthy. Philosophy, on the other hand, he compares to medicine. It might be bitter, it might be uncomfortable, but it heals. That analogy from Gorgias is one of the most cutting things Plato ever wrote, and it reveals what's really at stake for him. This isn't an academic squabble. It's about the soul of a civilization. When people can no longer distinguish between being persuaded and being informed, society rots from the inside. Protagoras, the most famous sophist of them all, declared that man is the measure of all things, meaning truth is relative. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. And Plato rejects that completely. He argues that if everything is relative, then nothing is knowable. If every opinion is equally valid, then no opinion carries weight. And that's not intellectual freedom, that's intellectual collapse. So when Plato attacks the Sophists, he's not just attacking a group of teachers. He's attacking an entire worldview. The idea that reality bends to language, that truth is just a tool, that the one who speaks best rules. He saw what that worldview did to Athens. He saw how rhetoric swayed juries, corrupted leaders, condemned the innocent, and he refused to accept it. For Plato, the pursuit of truth wasn't optional. It was the whole point. Plato presents one of his most striking analogies in Book 6 of the Republic, the Allegory of the Ship, and it cuts deep because it's about something we still see everywhere today. Here's the setup. Plato asks us to consider a ship. The owner of this ship is large and strong, but he's partially deaf. His eyesight is poor, and his knowledge of sailing almost non-existent. Now, the sailors on the ship are constantly fighting with each other. Every single one of them wants to take the helm. They all believe they deserve to steer. But here's the thing. None of them have ever actually studied navigation. None of them have learned the art. They don't even believe navigation is something that can be taught. And what do? They crowd around the ship owner. They beg, they flatter, they manipulate, whatever it takes to get him to hand over the wheel. Sometimes they even drug him. Sometimes they use force. And once one group sees control, they throw their rivals overboard or lock them away. Then they turn the voyage into a party, drinking, feasting, sailing wherever the wind takes them. But there's one person on this ship who actually knows what he's doing, the true navigator. He's studied the stars. He understands the seasons, the sky, the winds, the currents, everything that real navigation demands. And how do the sailors treat him? They call him a stargazer, useless, head in the clouds. They mock him, they ignore him, they wouldn't dream of letting him anywhere near the helm. That's Plato's Allegory, and it's not really about a ship. The ship is the state. The ship owner? That's the public, strong in numbers but easily swayed. The quarreling sailors? Those are the politicians, the demagogues, the ones who fight and scheme and flatter their way into power, not because they know how to lead, but because they know how to win. And the navigator, the one who actually understands how to steer, that's the philosopher. Plato argues that this is exactly what happens in a democracy. The people who seek power the hardest are usually the least qualified to hold it. And the people who actually possess wisdom, they're dismissed, ridiculed, pushed aside. He points out something brutal here. The sailors don't just happen to ignore the navigator. They genuinely believe he has nothing to offer. They've convinced themselves that steering a ship, running a state, requires no real knowledge. It's just about strength, popularity, boldness. Whoever shouts loudest gets the wheel. And Plato warns that's how societies destroy themselves, not through invasion, not through famine, but by handing the helm to people who have no idea where they're going. See, Plato isn't just being elitist for the sake of it. He's making a precise argument. Governing, he insists, is a skill, a craft, like medicine, like navigation. You wouldn't let a random crowd vote on how to treat a disease. You'd go to a doctor. So why, he asks, do we let untrained, unqualified people steer the entire state? This is Plato at his most provocative. He's not attacking the people, he's attacking the system. A system that rewards charm over competence, popularity over wisdom. And the most unsettling part, the navigator doesn't fight back. He doesn't campaign, he doesn't beg for the helm, because the moment you have to beg to lead, you've already lost. That's Plato's point. True knowledge doesn't perform, it doesn't sell itself. And in a world that only listens to the loudest voice, it gets drowned out. Most philosophers dance around death. They offer comfort. They offer hope. Plato does something far more audacious. He offers proof, or at least he claims to. In the Phaedo, one of his most powerful dialogues, Plato presents Socrates on his deathbed, hours away from drinking the hemlock. And what does Socrates do? He doesn't weep, he doesn't panic, he argues, calmly, methodically. He lays out a case, a rational case, that the soul cannot die. And this isn't some poetic gesture. Plato means it as philosophy. Hard, rigorous, logical. So what's the argument? Plato puts forward not one, but several arguments, and each one builds on the last. The first is the argument from opposites. Plato observes that in nature, opposites come from opposites. Sleep comes from waking. Waking comes from sleep. The cold becomes hot. The hot becomes cold. So death must come from life, and life must come from death. There has to be a cycle. The soul doesn't just vanish, it returns. Now, is that airtight? No. But Plato is pointing at something real. The structure of nature seems cyclical, not linear. And he's asking, why would the soul be the one exception? The second is the argument from Recollection. This one ties directly to his theory of forms. Plato argues that we recognize things like equality, beauty, justice, not because we learned them from scratch, but because the soul already knew them, before birth, before the body. When we encounter two roughly equal sticks, We somehow know they fall short of perfect equality. But where did that standard come from? Plato's answer? The soul encountered the forms before it entered the body. Learning, he argues, is really just remembering. And if the soul existed before birth, it can exist after death. The third, sometimes called the affinity argument, is about the nature of the soul itself. Plato draws a sharp line. The body is visible, composite, changeable. It decays, it breaks down. But the soul is invisible. It grasps the unchanging. It reaches toward the eternal forms. And Plato argues that things which are simple and invisible don't decompose. The body belongs to the world of becoming. The soul belongs to the world of being. It's more like the forms than like flesh. And then there's the final argument, the most ambitious one. Plato argues that the soul is what brings life to the body. It is the very principle of life itself. And just as fire cannot become cold and still be fire, the soul cannot admit death and still be a soul. Death is the opposite of what the soul is. So the soul, by its very nature, is deathless, immortal. Now, do these arguments hold up under modern scrutiny? That's a different conversation. But here's what matters. Plato isn't offering faith. He isn't offering mythology. He's doing something no one before him really attempted. He's trying to reason his way to immortality. And this changes everything about how he thinks we should live. Because if the soul is immortal, then your choices carry weight far beyond this life. Plato argues that the soul carries the marks of how it lived. A soul devoted to wisdom? It ascends. A soul chained to bodily pleasures? Its state is trapped, bound to the cycle, dragged back down. So this isn't just metaphysics for its own sake. It's ethics. Plato ties the fate of the soul directly to the way a person chooses to live. The stakes aren't temporary, they're infinite, and he wants you to feel that weight. Death, for Plato, isn't the end of the conversation. It's the reason the conversation matters at all. Most people hear the word God and they think of an all-powerful being who created everything from nothing, snapped his fingers, and the universe appeared. That's the image most of us carry. But Plato? He had a completely different vision. In the Timaeus, Plato introduces a figure called the Demiurge, and this figure changes everything we think we know about divine creation. The Demiurge is not a god who creates out of nothing. He's a craftsman, a shaper, an architect. Plato describes him as a divine artisan who looks at the eternal forms, those perfect, unchanging blueprints of reality, and then molds the physical world to resemble them as closely as possible. He doesn't conjure matter into existence. The matter is already there, chaotic, disordered, formless, and the Demiurge takes that raw, messy material and organizes it, gives it structure, gives it purpose. Think about what that means. Plato is arguing that the universe is not a creation, it's a construction. There's a massive difference. A creator makes something from nothing. A craftsman works with what he's got. And the Demiurge? He works with what he's got. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Plato argues that the Demiurge is fundamentally good. He's not indifferent, he's not cruel. He genuinely wants the cosmos to be as beautiful and ordered as possible. Plato says he looked at the eternal model, the perfect living being that contains all intelligible beings within it, and he wanted the physical world to mirror that perfection. His motivation? Pure goodness. He was free of jealousy, free of malice, and because he was good, he wanted everything else to be good too. But, and this is critical, the Demiurge is not omnipotent. He has limits. He's working with pre-existing matter that resists perfect order. Plato calls this the receptacle, a kind of chaotic medium that doesn't fully cooperate. So the Demiurge does the best he can. He persuades necessity through reason. He doesn't overpower it. he negotiates with it. This is a radical idea. Plato is essentially saying that imperfection in the world isn't the result of divine failure or punishment. It's the result of material limitation. The craftsman is excellent. His blueprint is flawless. But the material he's working with, it has its own stubborn nature. And the Demiurge doesn't create the forms either. That's another crucial distinction. The forms exist independently, eternally, perfectly, beyond time and space. The Demiurge looks up at them the way an architect looks at a blueprint he didn't draw. He's guided by them, inspired by them, but he didn't design them. They're above even him.
So, what is the Demiurge really? He's not the supreme being in the way most religious traditions describe God. He's more like a mediator, a bridge between the perfect world of the forms and the imperfect world of matter. He brings reason to chaos, order to disorder, meaning to randomness. Plato also makes it clear that the Demiurge fashioned the world soul and the individual souls, gave the cosmos a living, rational structure. The universe, in Plato's view, is not dead matter floating in a void. It's a living organism, ensouled, intelligent, designed with intention.
And that's the deeper point Plato is making. The cosmos is not an accident. It's not random. It's the product of rational, purposeful design, shaped by a being who valued goodness above all else. But it's also not perfect, because perfection belongs only to the forms. The physical world is always a copy, always an approximation, never the original. Plato doesn't think you're one person, not really. He argues that inside every human being, there's a war going on, a constant, invisible battle, and most people don't even know it's happening. In the Republic, Plato breaks the human soul into 3 distinct parts, 3 forces, 3 drives, each one pulling in a different direction, and whichever one wins, that determines the kind of person you become. The first part, reason, the logistikon. This is the part that thinks, calculates, weighs evidence, seeks truth. Plato sees this as the highest element of the soul. It's the philosopher in you, the part that can step back from desire, from emotion, and ask, what is actually good here? What is true? He doesn't just value reason, he elevates it. For Plato, reason isn't one voice among many, it's the only voice that should be in charge. The second part, spirit, the thumoides. This is where honor lives, ambition, courage, that fire in your chest when you've been wronged, that drive to stand up, to fight, to prove yourself. Plato doesn't dismiss this part. He respects it, but he sees it as a force that needs direction. Spirit without reason, that's just aggression, ego running wild. But spirit guided by reason, that's a warrior with a cause. That's discipline. The third part, appetite, the epithumedikon. This is the hungriest part of the soul. It wants food, drink, sex, money, pleasure, comfort, more, more, more. Plato warns that this part is insatiable. You can never fully satisfy it. Feed it and it grows. Give it what it wants and it demands something bigger. He sees appetite as the most dangerous force, not because desire itself is evil, but because it's relentless. It never stops pulling. So here's Plato's central question. Which part is running your life? He uses a striking metaphor, a charioteer driving 2 horses. One horse is noble, spirited, proud, responsive to command. The other is wild, unruly, stubborn, dragging the chariot toward every distraction in sight. The charioteer is reason, and his job, his entire purpose, is to keep both horses in line, to steer, to control. But Plato makes something very clear. Most people, the charioteer has lost the reins. They think they're making free choices. They think they're in control, but really they're being dragged by appetite, by unchecked emotion, by impulses they never bother to examine. And this isn't just about individual psychology. Plato extends this model to entire societies. He argues that a just city mirrors a just soul. The rulers represent reason. The soldiers represent spirit. The producers and merchants represent appetite. When each part does its job, and only its job, there's harmony, there's justice. But when appetite starts ruling, when desire overrides wisdom, collapse, corruption, tyranny. That's Plato's warning. The soul that lets appetite lead doesn't just become unhappy, it becomes enslaved to its own desires. And the worst part, it doesn't even realize it. He points out something deeply uncomfortable. The tyrant, the person who seems the most free, who indulges every craving, who answers to no one, is actually the most enslaved person alive, because he's controlled entirely by the lowest part of his soul. No reason, no order, just craving after craving after craving. So Plato's message isn't deny your desires, it's sharper than that. He argues that the good life, the truly free life, demands internal order. Reason must lead, spirit must serve, and appetite must be kept in check, not destroyed, governed. That's the difference between a human being and a three-headed monster tearing itself apart. Most people think of geometry as something you suffer through in school. Angles, theorems, proofs you'll never use again. But for Plato, geometry wasn't just math. It was the language God used to build the universe. That's not a metaphor. He meant it. In the Timaeus, Plato lays out one of the most ambitious ideas in the history of philosophy. He argues that the cosmos is not random, not chaotic, not some accident of colliding matter. The universe, he insists, is a work of craftsmanship, designed with precision, structured with intention, and built on geometric principles so deep that most people never even notice them. At the center of this idea is the Demiurge, a divine craftsman, not a god who creates out of nothing, but one who looks at the eternal forms and shapes raw, disordered matter into something beautiful, something rational. And the tool the Demiurge uses? Geometry. Plato assigns specific geometric solids to the basic elements of the physical world. Fire is the tetrahedron, sharp, piercing, the simplest and most aggressive shape. Earth is the cube, stable, grounded, immovable. Air is the octahedron, water, the icosahedron, and the cosmos itself, the dodecahedron, 12 perfect pentagonal faces, the shape closest to a sphere, the shape of the whole. These aren't decorative ideas. Plato argues that the very structure of matter, the stuff everything is made of, is geometric at its core. The elements aren't just things, they're shapes, patterns, ratios, and the way they interact, transform, break apart, and recombine, all of it follows geometric rules. Now, here's what makes this extraordinary. Plato is writing this around 360 BC, over 2,000 years before molecular science, before atomic theory, before anyone had the tools to peer inside matter. He's saying that reality has a hidden mathematical structure, that beneath the mess and noise of the physical world, there's order, deep, elegant, geometric order. And he doesn't stop at physics. Plato argues that the cosmos itself is alive. It has a soul, the world soul, and that soul is constructed according to mathematical ratios and harmonic intervals. The movements of the planets, the cycles of time, the structure of the heavens, all of it, he claims, reflects a rational, musical, geometric harmony. This is why geometry held such a sacred place in Plato's academy. The famous inscription above its entrance, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here," wasn't academic gatekeeping, it was a philosophical statement. Plato believed that without geometry, you couldn't understand reality, you couldn't access the forms, you couldn't even begin to grasp how the cosmos holds together. Because for Plato, geometry isn't something humans invented, it's something humans discovered. The triangles, the ratios, the proportions, they exist whether we see them or not. They are eternal, unchanging, and they belong to the realm of the forms, not the realm of the senses. So when Plato looks at the night sky, he doesn't just see stars, he sees structure, intelligence, purpose. He sees the fingerprint of reason pressed into every atom, every orbit, every element. And that's the real weight of this idea. Plato isn't just doing cosmology, he's making a claim about the nature of existence itself, that the universe is not blind, not indifferent, it is rational, down to its geometry, down to its bones. The physical world, he warns, will always be imperfect, always shifting. But the geometry beneath it, that's eternal. That's the closest the material world ever gets to the divine. Here's one of the most controversial things Plato ever proposed, and he knew it was controversial. He even hesitated before saying it. In Book 3 of the Republic, Plato introduces what he calls the noble lie, a myth, a story, a deliberate fabrication told to the citizens of his ideal city, not to exploit them, not to manipulate them for some tyrant's gain, but to hold the entire social order together. And the lie goes like this. Every citizen would be told that they were born from the earth itself, that the land they live on is their mother, and that during their formation beneath the ground, the gods mixed different metals into their souls: gold for the rulers, silver for the warriors, bronze and iron for the farmers, the craftsmen, the laborers. Your metal determines your role, your place, your purpose in the city. Now, pause on that for a second. This is Plato, the man who built his entire philosophy on the pursuit of truth, the man who despised the Sophists for twisting words and deceiving people. And here he is advocating a lie, a foundational one, baked right into the DNA of the state. So what's going on? Plato argues that the noble lie isn't about deception for its own sake, it's about unity. He sees it as a necessary fiction, a shared story that binds people together, gives them a common origin, and convinces them that the social hierarchy isn't arbitrary, it's natural, it's divine, it's built into who you are. And that's the key move. He's not just assigning people roles, he's making them believe those roles are part of their nature, that a farmer doesn't farm because he was forced into it, he farms because his soul is made of bronze. A ruler doesn't rule out of ambition, she rules because gold runs through her being. But Plato adds something crucial, something people often miss. He insists that the metal in your soul doesn't have to match the metal of your parents. A gold-souled child can be born to bronze parents, and a bronze-souled child can be born to rulers. And when that happens, the child must be moved, reassigned, no exceptions. He warns that the city will be destroyed the moment an iron or bronze soul takes the seat of a guardian. So it's not a rigid caste system. Not exactly. There's mobility, but it's mobility determined by nature, not by choice. And it's enforced by the rulers who are supposed to be wise enough to detect the metal in each soul. Now, here's the real tension. Plato knows this is a lie. He calls it one. He doesn't dress it up. He doesn't pretend it's a revelation from the gods. He presents it as a political tool, a calculated myth designed to prevent envy, resentment, and civil conflict. And that raises a brutal question. Can a just society be built on a lie? Can truth and deception coexist in the same political structure? One at the top among the philosopher kings who know the truth, and one at the bottom among the citizens who live inside the myth. Plato says yes. He argues that the masses aren't capable of grasping the philosophical truths that justify the social order. So you give them a story instead. A beautiful, coherent, stabilizing story. One that makes them feel like they belong. Not because they were told to, but because they were made to. That's the noble lie. Not a trick, not propaganda in the cynical sense, but a philosophical concession. A moment where even Plato admits that truth alone isn't enough to govern a city. You need a myth. You need belief. You need a story people can live inside of. And that, whether you agree with it or not, is one of the most honest things any political thinker has ever said. This is one of the most shocking moves in the history of philosophy, and most people don't realize just how radical it was. Plato goes after Homer. Homer, the poet who was essentially the foundation of Greek education, Greek morality, Greek identity. Every Greek child grew up on Homer. His epics weren't just stories, they were scripture. They shaped how people understood the gods, heroism, duty, love, death, everything. And Plato says, get rid of him. Not quietly, not as a footnote. He dedicates serious portions of the Republic to dismantling the authority of poets. And he does it with surgical precision. So why? Why does a philosopher declare war on the most beloved poet of his civilization? Because Plato sees poetry as dangerous. Not trivially dangerous. Dangerous at the deepest level, dangerous to the soul. Here's his argument. Plato holds that reality exists in the realm of the forms, those eternal, unchanging truths that sit above the physical world. The physical world? It's already a copy, a shadow of the real thing. And what does the poet do? The poet copies the copy. The poet imitates appearances. Not truth, not the form, just the surface. He lays this out clearly in Book 10 of the Republic. A carpenter makes a bed. He's working with some understanding of what a bed is, its function, its form. But the painter who paints a picture of that bed, he's 3 steps removed from reality. He doesn't know how to build a bed. He doesn't understand the form of a bed. He just reproduces how it looks from one angle. And Plato argues the poet does the same thing. Homer writes about war, about courage, about justice, but does he actually know what justice is? Has he ever governed a city? Has he ever led men into battle based on a real understanding of virtue? Plato says no. The poet creates an illusion of knowledge, and that illusion is what makes him so dangerous, because people believe it. But there's a second layer here. And this one cuts even deeper. Plato argues that poetry doesn't just deceive the mind, it corrupts the soul. It feeds the emotional, irrational part of us. When Homer shows Achilles weeping, raging, losing control, the audience feels that. They identify with it. They let their own emotions swell in response, meaningless. He's saying it must be ruled by reason, and poetry does the opposite. It puts emotion in the driver's seat. It glorifies grief, rage, desire, all the things that the philosopher is supposed to master. So in the ideal city Plato constructs in the Republic, the poets are expelled, not imprisoned, not silenced, escorted out, with honor even, but expelled nonetheless. Because a just city in Plato's vision cannot afford to let its citizens be shaped by beautiful lies. And here's what makes this so striking. Plato himself is one of the greatest literary artists in the history of Western thought.
The dialogues are dramatic, they're vivid, they're full of myth and metaphor. He uses allegory, the cave, the allegory of the sun, the allegory of the allegory of the allegory of the allegory. No, he uses powerful imagery constantly. So there's a tension here. Plato, the philosopher, wages war on art. But Plato, the writer, he's an artist himself. He knows the power of storytelling. He knows its grip on the human soul. And that's precisely why he fears it.
In Book 2 of the Republic, Plato puts forward one of the most uncomfortable thought experiments in all of philosophy. It comes through the voice of Glaucon, Plato's own brother, who challenges Socrates with a story that strips morality down to its bare bones. Here's the tale. A shepherd named Gyges discovers a ring. Not an ordinary ring. This ring makes him invisible, completely. No one can see him. No one can catch him. No one can hold him accountable for anything. And what does Gyges do with this power? He seduces the queen, murders the king, takes the throne. He does whatever he wants, because he can, because there are zero consequences. And Glaucon pushes the question hard. He says, give this ring to a just man and an unjust man. What happens? Both will act the same way. Both will lie, steal, take, dominate. Because morality, Glaucon argues, is nothing more than a contract, a leash. People behave well only because they're afraid of getting caught. Remove that fear, the mask comes off. That's the challenge Plato is grappling with, and it's devastating because it forces one question. Are you moral or are you just careful? Plato doesn't dismiss this argument. He takes it seriously, dead seriously, because he knows Glaucon has touched a nerve. Most people, if they're honest with themselves, would have to pause before answering. But Plato's response, through Socrates, goes somewhere unexpected. He doesn't argue that people are naturally good. He doesn't appeal to religion or divine punishment. He goes deeper. Plato argues that injustice doesn't just harm the victim, it destroys the person who commits it, from the inside. He compares the soul to a kind of internal order, reason, spirit, and appetite, all working in harmony. When a person acts unjustly, even if no one ever finds out, that harmony breaks. The appetites take over, reason collapses. The soul becomes enslaved to its lowest impulses. So the man who uses the ring, he thinks he's free. He thinks he's winning. But Plato says he's actually the most enslaved person alive, a prisoner of his own desires. He's lost the only thing that ever truly mattered, the internal structure of a well-ordered soul. And here's where Plato draws the sharp line. He argues that the just person, the one who doesn't use the ring even when they could, is happier, not in some superficial feel-good sense, but genuinely, fundamentally better off, because their soul is intact, their inner world is in order, they're not at war with themselves. Plato flips the entire question on its head. The world assumes that justice is a burden, something we tolerate because we have to. But he insists it's the opposite. Justice isn't the cost of living in society, it's the condition of living well, period. And he warns, the unjust man who escapes all punishment, who gets everything he wants, who fools everyone around him, that man is sick. His soul is diseased. He just doesn't know it yet. This is what makes the Ring of Gyges so powerful in Plato's hands. It's not just a clever riddle, it's a mirror. He holds it up and asks, "What would you do?" And then he says, "Your answer doesn't reveal the world, it reveals you." Plato's position is uncompromising. Morality isn't a performance for others, it's the architecture of the self. Break it,
even in secret, even in the dark, and you don't just do wrong, you become wrong.
Here's a question that should bother you. How do you recognize something you've never been taught? You see two lines, one slightly longer than the other. You know, instantly, they're not equal. But how? Nobody sat you down and showed you perfect equality. You've never encountered it. Not once. Not in the physical world. And yet you have this standard in your mind. You measure things against it, effortlessly, without thinking. Plato notices this, and he refuses to let it slide. His answer is one of the boldest claims in the history of philosophy. Plato argues that you're not learning when you acquire knowledge, you're remembering. He calls it anamnesis, recollection, and he means it literally. The soul, Plato claims, existed before the body, before birth, before flesh, before any sensory experience. The soul dwelt among the forms. It knew perfect beauty, perfect justice, perfect equality, not as abstractions, as realities, direct contact, unmediated knowledge. But then the soul enters the body, and it forgets. The trauma of birth, the noise of the senses, the weight of physical existence, it all buries what the soul once knew. So what we call learning is really just the slow, difficult process of digging it back up. Plato doesn't just assert this, he demonstrates it. In the Meno, he stages one of the most famous scenes in all of philosophy. Socrates pulls aside an uneducated slave boy. A boy with no training in geometry, none, and through nothing but questions, no lectures, no formulas, no instruction, Socrates leads this boy to solve a complex geometric problem, the doubling of a square. The boy stumbles at first, gets it wrong, but Socrates keeps asking, keeps pressing, and step by step, the boy arrives at the correct answer, on his own. Plato's point, the knowledge was already there. Socrates didn't put it in, he pulled it out. The boy wasn't learning something new, he was recovering something lost. And if that's true, then the soul must have known it before this life, before this body. Now, this isn't just a clever trick with geometry. Plato is making a devastating argument against a purely empirical view of knowledge. If everything we know comes from sensory experience, then we should never be able to grasp concepts that go beyond the senses. But we do, all the time. We understand justice, even though no perfectly just act has ever occurred. We grasp beauty, even though every beautiful thing fades. We recognize equality, even though no two objects in the world are ever truly equal. Where does that knowledge come from? Plato says it comes from before, and this reshapes everything about how he views education. A teacher for Plato isn't someone who fills an empty vessel. A teacher is someone who awakens what's already inside. The soul doesn't need information poured into it. It needs the right questions, the right provocations, the right moments of confusion that force it to look inward. That's what Socrates does. That's the entire Socratic method. Not teaching, but midwifery, helping the soul give birth to what it already carries. So when Plato talks about recollection, he's not being metaphorical. He's making a claim about the structure of reality. The soul is older than the body. Knowledge is older than experience. And the deepest truths you'll ever encounter, you already know them. You've just forgotten. And philosophy, real philosophy, is the act of remembering. Plato doesn't see the human soul as one unified thing. He breaks it apart into 3 distinct parts. And the way those parts interact, that determines everything about who you are and how you live. In the Republic, Plato lays out his theory of the tripartite soul. 3 forces, 3 drives, constantly pulling in different directions inside every single person. First, reason, the rational part. This is the part that thinks, calculates, seeks truth. It's the part that can step back and ask, what's actually good for me? Not what feels good, not what I want right now, but what is genuinely, objectively good. Plato argues this is the highest part of the soul, the one that should be in charge. Second, spirit, the spirited part. This is where courage lives, ambition, honor, the fire in your chest when someone disrespects you, the drive to fight for what you believe in. It's not rational, but it's not base either. It sits in the middle. And Plato argues that when it's properly trained, spirit becomes reason's greatest ally. It enforces what reason commands. Third, appetite, the desiring part. This is the beast. Hunger, thirst, lust, greed, the craving for pleasure, for more, for now. Plato sees this as the largest and most dangerous part of the soul, not because desire itself is evil, but because it's insatiable. It never stops wanting, and if left unchecked, it devours everything. Now, here's where Plato makes it vivid. In the Phaedrus, he gives us the allegory of the charioteer. The soul is a chariot pulled by 2 horses. One horse is noble, strong, disciplined, obedient. That's spirit. The other horse is wild, ugly, stubborn, constantly dragging the chariot toward the ground. That's appetite. And the charioteer? That's reason, holding the reins, trying to steer both horses upward, toward truth, toward the forms, toward the good. But the struggle is real. Plato doesn't pretend this is easy. The dark horse fights, it bucks, it pulls hard. And if the charioteer loses grip, even for a moment, the whole chariot plunges downward, into chaos, into a life ruled by impulse. Plato argues that a just person, a truly good person, is someone whose soul is in proper order. Reason leads, spirit supports, appetite obeys. That's justice at the individual level, not some external set of rules, not following laws out of fear, but an internal harmony, each part of the soul doing its job and nothing more. And when that order breaks down, Plato warns that you get tyranny inside the soul itself. A person ruled by appetite becomes a slave to their own desires. They chase pleasure after pleasure, never satisfied, never at peace. Plato describes the tyrannical soul in the Republic as the most miserable of all, not because they lack things, but because they're consumed by wanting. The spirited part can go wrong too. Without reason's guidance, it becomes reckless aggression, blind ambition, pride without wisdom. Plato makes it clear, spirit needs direction. Without it, courage becomes violence. So what's the answer? Plato points to education, philosophy, the disciplined pursuit of wisdom. He argues that only through training the rational part, sharpening it, strengthening it, can a person bring the whole soul into alignment. You don't kill the beast, you don't eliminate desire, you tame it, you give it boundaries, you make it serve the higher purpose. And that's Plato's vision of the good life. Not a life without passion, not a life without drive, but a life where every part of you is in its right place, ordered, balanced, harmonized, reason on the reins, always. Every lost civilization theory, every underwater city documentary, every conspiracy about ancient advanced technology, all of it traces back to one man, Plato. He's the source, the only source. And here's what most people miss. He made it up, on purpose. The story of Atlantis appears in 2 of Plato's later dialogues,
the Timaeus, and the Critias. And right from the start, something is off. The tale is presented through a chain of retellings. Critias heard it from his grandfather. His grandfather heard it from Solon. Solon heard it from Egyptian priests. Layer after layer of distance. Plato is practically waving a flag. Don't take this literally. But the story itself? It's vivid. Atlantis, Plato describes, was a massive island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we'd call the Strait of Gibraltar, a civilization of enormous power and wealth. The god Poseidon shaped it, concentric rings of water and land, bridges, harbors, temples covered in silver and gold, a military force that threatened the entire Mediterranean. And on the other side, Athens, but not the Athens of Plato's day, an ancient, idealized Athens, a city of disciplined, virtuous citizens, modest, unified, governed by wisdom, not wealth. That contrast is everything, because this isn't a history lesson, it's a moral argument. Plato sets up Atlantis as a civilization that had it all: divine origins, abundant resources, extraordinary engineering. But over time, something rotted from the inside. He describes how the people of Atlantis slowly lost their divine nature. The godly portion in them faded, diluted generation after generation by human greed and ambition. They became aggressive, expansionist, hungry for domination. And that's when Plato delivers the blow. Zeus looks down, sees what Atlantis has become, a once noble people now consumed by arrogance, and decides to punish them. The Critias actually breaks off mid-sentence, right at this moment. We never get the ending. Whether that's intentional or the dialogue is simply unfinished, scholars still debate. But the message doesn't need a final paragraph. It's already clear. Plato is warning about what happens when a society abandons virtue for power. Atlantis isn't a geography lesson. It's a mirror. He holds it up and asks, what happens when a civilization has every advantage? Wealth, strength, resources, but no moral foundation. It destroys itself, not because of an external enemy, because of its own corruption. And the idealized Athens in the story? That's no accident either. Plato contrasts Atlantis with a version of Athens that embodies everything he argues for in the Republic: order, justice, citizens who serve the common good rather than private ambition. He's saying, this is what a city looks like when reason governs. And that, pointing to Atlantis sinking beneath the waves, is what happens when appetite takes over. So the real tragedy isn't that people turned a philosophical parable into a treasure hunt. It's that they completely ignored the point. Plato doesn't care where Atlantis is on a map. He cares about what it represents: unchecked power, moral decay, a society so drunk on its own greatness that it can't see the collapse coming. And here's what makes it sting. Plato wrote this while watching Athens, the real Athens, stumble through its own imperial overreach. The Peloponnesian War had already gutted the city. Democratic corruption was rampant. He'd seen what happens when a great civilization stops asking what is good and starts asking what can we take. Atlantis wasn't ancient history. It was a warning, dressed up as a myth, aimed directly at the present. Plato invented Atlantis, not to start a legend, but to end an illusion. Here's something that should stop you cold. Plato, one of the most prolific writers in the history of philosophy, may have deliberately held back his most important ideas, never wrote them down. Not in any dialogue, not in any letter, nowhere. They're called the Agrapha Dogmata, the Unwritten Doctrines, and they've haunted scholars for centuries. We know about them mostly through Aristotle, Plato's own student. In several passages, Aristotle refers to teachings Plato shared only orally inside the academy, behind closed doors, with a select circle of advanced students. Teachings that went beyond anything in the Republic, the Timaeus, or the Phaedrus. Teachings about the deepest foundations of reality. And what were they about? Two principles, the one and the indefinite dyad. Plato reportedly argued that at the very root of everything, beneath the forms, beneath the cosmos, beneath all structure, there are two ultimate principles. The one represents unity, limit, order. The indefinite dyad represents multiplicity, excess, the unlimited. And from the interaction of these two, everything else emerges. The forms themselves, numbers, the structure of reality. All of it generated from this primal tension between unity and plurality. This is staggering, because if it's true, then the theory of forms, the idea most people associate with Plato, isn't even the final layer. It's a middle step. The forms themselves are derived from something even more fundamental, something Plato chose to teach only through the living voice. But why? Why would he refuse to write this down? Plato gives us a clue. In the Phaedrus, he argues that writing is a dangerously limited medium. Written words can't defend themselves. They can't respond to questions. They can't adjust to the reader's level of understanding. They just sit there, repeating the same thing to everyone, whether the reader is ready for it or not. He compares writing to painting. It looks alive, but ask it something, and it stays silent. And in the seventh letter, if we accept it as authentic, Plato goes even further. He states plainly that the things he cares about most have never been put into writing, and never will be. Because genuine philosophical understanding, he insists, can't be transmitted through text. It happens only through sustained dialogue, through friction, through the slow, difficult process of two minds wrestling with an idea until suddenly insight flashes like a fire catching from a spark. That's not anti-intellectual. That's radically serious about what real knowledge demands. Now, and this matters, not every scholar buys this. Some argue the unwritten doctrines are overblown, that Aristotle misunderstood or simplified what Plato taught. That the dialogues already contain everything Plato intended to communicate. The debate has raged for decades, especially since the Tübingen school brought these doctrines back into the spotlight in the 20th century. But here's what can't be dismissed. Plato clearly believed that some truths are too important, too easily distorted, to be left to the page. He didn't trust writing with his deepest insights. He trusted people, conversation, the living exchange between teacher and student. And that tells us something profound about how Plato understood philosophy itself. It wasn't a body of doctrines to be memorized. It wasn't a book to be read. It was a practice, an encounter, something that only happens in real time, between real minds, in real dialogue. So the greatest irony of Plato's legacy might be this: the philosopher we know best through his writings believed that writing could never carry the deepest truth. Most people think of Plato as a political thinker, or an ethical one. But in the Timaeus, he does something wildly ambitious. He tries to explain how the universe itself came into being. And at the center of that explanation is the Demiurge. Not a god in the way most people understand gods. Not an all-powerful creator who snaps the world into existence from nothing. Plato's Demiurge is a craftsman, a divine artisan, a builder who looks at chaos, raw, formless, disordered matter, and shapes it, molds it, organizes it into a cosmos. And he doesn't create out of nothing. That's the crucial distinction. Plato argues that the material already exists. It's just a mess, a swirling, unstable chaos with no structure, no pattern, no purpose. The Demiurge takes that chaos and imposes order on it, not by force, by reason, by using the eternal forms as his blueprint. So the Demiurge looks to the forms, the perfect, unchanging models of everything, and crafts the physical world as the best possible imitation of that perfection. He doesn't invent beauty, he copies it. He doesn't define justice, he reflects it. The universe, in Plato's vision, is a work of art. And the Demiurge is the artist who builds it by gazing at something higher than himself. That's a radical idea, because it means the physical world isn't random. It's not an accident. It's not meaningless. Plato argues that the cosmos is rational, designed with intelligence and purpose. Every star, every orbit, every element, arranged according to mathematical proportion and harmony. But here's where it gets interesting.
The Demiurge is not omnipotent. He works with what he's given. And what he's given, the raw material, the receptacle, as Plato calls it, resists perfection. It pushes back. It's stubborn, unpredictable, imperfect. So the Demiurge does the best he can. He produces the best possible world, but not a perfect one. There's a gap, always a gap, between the model and the copy. And Plato is very deliberate about that. He argues that imperfection in the world isn't a sign of a flawed creator. It's a consequence of working with flawed material. The Demiurge is good, entirely good. He has no jealousy, no malice, no hidden agenda. He wants the cosmos to be as beautiful and ordered as it can possibly be. But matter itself sets the limit.
Now, is the Demiurge literal? Is Plato saying there's an actual divine craftsman out there who built the universe? Scholars have debated this for centuries. Some read the Timaeus as a myth, a likely story, as Plato himself calls it, a way of expressing deep truths through narrative rather than argument. Others take it more literally. Either way, the philosophical weight is the same. Plato is making a claim about the nature of reality, that intelligence precedes matter, that mind comes before the physical. That the universe is not a product of blind chance, but of deliberate, rational design. The Demiurge is his answer to the question every civilization eventually asks. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why does that something have order? And his answer is simple. Because something intelligent made it that way. Not through emotion, not through whim, through reason. Through a love of the good, through a desire to bring order where there was none. The Demiurge doesn't just build the universe. He reveals Plato's deepest conviction, that reason is the ultimate creative force, not power, not will, reason, and the cosmos itself is the proof. Around 387 BC, Plato does something that would change the entire trajectory of Western civilization. He opens a school, not a lecture hall, not a formal institution with degrees and diplomas, a grove, a sacred grove on the outskirts of Athens, dedicated to the hero Academos. And from that name, the Academy. The word itself comes from Plato. Every university, every academic institution, every place that calls itself an academy, it traces back to this. One man, one grove, one decision. And what Plato builds there isn't just a school. It's a revolution in how human beings pursue knowledge. Before Plato, philosophy was scattered. You had individual thinkers, the pre-Socratics, the Sophists, traveling from city to city, teaching for fees, debating in public squares. There was no permanent home for sustained intellectual inquiry, no place where people could come together year after year and dedicate their lives to the search for truth. Plato creates that place, and the way he structures it matters. The academy isn't about memorizing doctrines. It's not about sitting passively while a master lectures. Plato builds it around dialogue, around questioning, around the kind of rigorous back-and-forth examination that he dramatizes in his own writings. The dialectical method, The method of Socrates becomes the engine of the academy. Students don't come to learn what to think, they come to learn how to think. And the subjects? Plato insists on mathematics. Geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, harmonics, these aren't optional, they're prerequisites. There's a famous, possibly legendary, inscription said to have been placed above the entrance. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here.
Why geometry? Because Plato sees mathematics as the bridge between the physical world and the world of the forms. Numbers don't change. Geometric truths don't shift with opinion or culture. They're eternal. And for Plato, training the mind in mathematics is training it to perceive what is real, what is permanent, beyond the mess of sensory experience. But the academy isn't just about math. It's about philosophy in its fullest sense: ethics, politics, metaphysics, epistemology, the nature of the soul, the structure of the cosmos. Everything connects. Plato doesn't compartment. They aren't ordinary students. Aristotle enters the academy at 17 and stays for 20 years. 20 years. The man who would go on to become arguably the most influential philosopher in history, he's shaped inside Plato's school. That alone tells you something about what this place was. But here's what's truly remarkable. The academy doesn't die with Plato. He passes in 347 BC, and the school continues. New heads take over. The philosophy evolves, sometimes in directions Plato himself might not have recognized. The skeptical academy under Arcelius, the later return to dogmatic Platonism, waves of reinterpretation, debate, transformation. And it lasts, not for a decade, not for a century. For roughly 900 years, until the Roman Emperor Justinian shuts it down in 529 AD. 9 centuries of continuous intellectual activity, rooted in what one man planted in a grove outside Athens. No other school in the ancient world comes close. And Plato's vision, that philosophy requires community, that truth is pursued through sustained collective inquiry, that education must shape the soul and not just fill the mind, that vision doesn't end in 529 AD either. It seeds the monastic schools, the medieval universities, the entire Western tradition of higher learning. The academy is gone, but its DNA is everywhere. There's a famous line from Alfred North Whitehead. He said that all of Western philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. And that's not flattery, that's a statement of fact. 24 centuries. That's how long Plato has been shaping the way human beings think, not just about philosophy, about everything: politics, ethics, education, art, love, the nature of reality itself. Every major thinker who came after him, whether they agreed with him or fought against him, had to reckon with what he built. And that's the key word: reckon. You don't just read Plato and move on. You wrestle with him. You push back. You think you found a flaw. And then you realize he anticipated your objection 3 dialogues ago. That's what makes him different from almost any other thinker in history. He doesn't just present ideas. He constructs a world, a complete architecture of thought. And once you step inside it, you can't fully step back out. Aristotle, Plato's own student, spent his entire career pushing against his teacher's framework. But even in his rebellion, he was shaped by it. Every argument Aristotle made was, in some way, a response to Plato. That's not meekness, that's gravity. Plato set the terms. Everyone else played on his field, and it didn't stop with the ancient world. The early Christian theologians, Augustine especially, absorbed Plato's ideas so deeply that they became inseparable from Western religious thought. The forms became the mind of God. The soul's ascent toward the good
became the soul's ascent toward the divine. Plato's fingerprints are all over the foundations of theology, even where his name isn't mentioned. Jump forward. Descartes, sitting alone by his fire, doubting everything, that's a Platonic impulse. The distrust of the senses, the search for certainty beyond the physical world.
Kant's distinction between the world as it appears and the world as it truly is, that's the cave, repackaged, refined, but the bones are Plato's. Even the people who reject Plato can't escape him. Nietzsche attacked Plato with everything he had, called him the great corrupter of Western thought, the one who taught humanity to distrust life, the body, the earth. But what was Nietzsche doing? He was defining himself against Plato. Which means Plato was still the reference point, still the center of gravity. You can rebel against a giant, but if you spend your life doing it, the giant still owns the conversation. And that's what's so remarkable. Plato doesn't survive because people agree with him. He survives because his questions are unanswerable. What is justice? What is truth? What is the good life? Is the world we see the real world, or a shadow of something deeper? These aren't questions from 380 BC. These are questions that hit you at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep. They're permanent. They don't expire. Plato built something that no single philosopher has ever managed to tear down. Not because his answers are always right, but because his questions are always alive. They regenerate. Every generation picks them up and finds something new inside them. So when Whitehead called all of philosophy a footnote to Plato, he wasn't exaggerating. He was diagnosing something. Every philosophical tradition, rationalism, idealism, existentialism, even the ones that claim to reject him, carries traces of his thought in their DNA. Plato doesn't just belong to the history of philosophy, he is the history of philosophy, the starting line, the framework, the ghost in every argument. And 2,400 years later, no one has managed to exorcise him.